It was a late afternoon, and the city streets were busy with the usual rhythm of life. Cars honked in the distance, people hurried along the sidewalks, and the faint smell of street food mixed with the scent of exhaust from passing vehicles. Among the traffic, a man in a crisp military uniform was driving home from work. His uniform was neat, the medals and insignia on his chest reflecting years of dedication and service. He was not in a hurry, but he was mindful of the traffic rules, moving steadily along the road. His mind was still partially at the office, reviewing reports, planning upcoming operations, and thinking about the responsibilities he carried as a senior officer in the military. He had always taken pride in his work, and in the way his uniform represented discipline, service, and integrity. Today had been a long day, with meetings that ran late, discussions about sensitive operations, and countless calls to manage personnel and resources. Despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of satisfaction in his heart. He knew the work he did mattered, and he carried that knowledge quietly without needing anyone else's recognition. As he approached an intersection, a police car pulled out from a side street behind him. The man did not think much of it at first. After all, traffic stops happened often, and he had nothing to hide. But soon the police car began following him more closely than necessary, its lights flashing briefly before turning off. The man slowed down, maintaining his lane and checking the rearview mirror. The officer inside seemed tense, his eyes fixed on the man in the uniform, watching every move he made. The senior officer felt a small knot of unease. He had been in many tense situations in his life, both on duty and off, and he could sense when someone's behavior was more than routine. Still, he kept calm, reminding himself that escalating the situation would not help. He planned to cooperate fully, answer questions politely, and continue on his way. After all, he had done nothing wrong. The police car signaled, and the man pulled over to the side of the road. The officer stepped out quickly, his boots clicking against the asphalt. He was a young man in his early 30s, but there was a hardened edge to his face, a certain coldness in the way he approached the car. He didn't greet the man or explain why he was being stopped. Instead, his hand rested lightly on the holster at his side, and his eyes scanned the uniform with a mixture of suspicion and judgment. "License and registration," the officer barked, his tone sharp and impatient. There was no warmth, no attempt at civility, only a demand that carried an unspoken assumption. The man handed over his documents calmly, placing them neatly on the dashboard. He smiled slightly, a gesture meant to diffuse tension. "Good afternoon, officer," he said. "Is there a problem?" The officer did not respond immediately. He leaned closer to the car, squinting through the window. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked, though it was clear he didn't expect a truthful answer. His eyes flicked from the man's face to his uniform and back again, as if trying to read his intentions. "Yes, sir," the man replied evenly. "I would like to know, though, why you decided to pull me over." His voice was steady, controlled, and carried a calm authority that came from years of command experience. The officer's hand twitched slightly near his holster, a subtle sign of his rising agitation. The senior officer noticed it but did not react. He had learned long ago that in tense situations, maintaining composure was often the best weapon. Raising his voice or showing fear would only escalate the situation. He remained seated, hands visible on the steering wheel, posture straight and confident. There was no sign of anger or hostility, only quiet firmness. "You need to step out of the car," the officer suddenly ordered. His tone had changed, sharper now, bordering on aggressive. The senior officer's heart did not race, but he felt the gravity of the moment. He could sense the officer's prejudice, the assumptions that had nothing to do with traffic violations. Yet he did not argue. Instead, he complied slowly, opening the car door and stepping out. His uniform was immaculate, his posture straight, and his movements deliberate and calm. The officer walked around the front of the car, keeping a close eye on him. "Do you know how dangerous it is to be stopped by me?" he asked, his voice low, almost threatening. "Do you know what could happen if I don't trust you?" There was a challenge in his words, a test of control over the situation. The senior officer looked at him directly without flinching. "Yes," he said softly, "I understand. That is why I am cooperating fully. I have nothing to hide." There was no arrogance in his voice, only honesty and steadiness. The officer's eyes narrowed. He didn't like the calmness, the lack of fear. It was unsettling for him to see someone so composed in the face of potential danger. A few pedestrians walking nearby noticed the tension. They paused for a moment, curious and concerned. One woman whispered to her companion, "Why is the officer acting like that? That man hasn't done anything wrong." The companion shrugged, unsure of how to respond. Moments like these were rare but striking. Moments when the ordinary rhythm of the street was interrupted by human tension and the potential for conflict. The officer circled the car slowly, examining it for any reason to justify his suspicion. His gaze lingered on the uniform again, and the senior officer could feel the weight of the assumptions being made. This was not about traffic rules. It was about perception, about bias, about a snap judgment based on appearances rather than facts. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. He knew the officer's actions were wrong, but reacting with anger would not help. Patience, control, and dignity were his allies now. Finally, the officer stopped in front of him. "Step closer," he demanded. The man moved slowly, keeping his hands visible. Every movement was deliberate, measured. He spoke calmly, trying to establish dialogue. "I am here to cooperate. Please tell me what the concern is so we can resolve it safely." His words were simple but firm, carrying the quiet authority of someone who had led troops, managed crises, and faced danger in far more challenging circumstances. The officer's eyes flicked down to the man's hands, then back to his face as if trying to read some hidden intention, but there was none. The senior officer's eyes held nothing but calm and clarity. In that moment, it became clear that the officer's assumptions were unfounded. The man was no threat. He was a professional, a person of integrity, and someone who demanded to be treated with respect, not suspicion. The air between them was thick with tension, a mix of authority, fear, and unspoken bias. The pedestrians had moved a little closer, some taking out phones, sensing that this was not an ordinary traffic stop. Yet the senior officer did not waver. He continued to speak in a steady voice, his tone calm but assertive. "Officer, I am here to cooperate fully. There is no reason for alarm. Let us handle this professionally." For a moment, the young officer hesitated. The senior officer's demeanor was so composed that it disrupted his assumptions. The edge in his voice softened slightly, though his hand remained near his holster. He was unsure, caught between his training, his bias, and the reality in front of him. The senior officer noticed the subtle shift and chose his words carefully. "We are both here to protect and serve, aren't we? Let's handle this without escalation." His voice was calm, almost soothing, but firm enough to convey authority. The officer blinked, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. He had expected fear, resistance, or submission. Instead, he found patience, dignity, and authority staring back at him. The pedestrians around began whispering again, sensing the shift. One elderly man murmured, "That man is calm. He's not afraid at all." The officer looks uneasy now. The senior officer could sense the attention but did not let it distract him. His focus remained on ensuring the encounter remained safe and controlled. Time seemed to stretch. Every second felt heavier than the last. The officer adjusted his stance, the weight of the situation beginning to press on him. He had approached this stop with assumptions, with prejudice, and now those assumptions were challenged by the quiet authority of a man in uniform who had faced real danger and responsibility far beyond a routine traffic stop. The senior officer continued to speak, his words measured, steady. "We can solve this calmly, officer. There is no reason for confrontation. I am here to cooperate, and I hope we can resolve this professionally." His eyes were steady, his posture unwavering. The officer finally hesitated, his fingers brushing his holster, then stopping mid-motion. The tension hung in the air like a heavy fog. For the first time, the officer seemed unsure. He had anticipated an ordinary stop, an easy demonstration of power over someone he assumed was less capable or submissive. Instead, he was facing a person who embodied authority, calmness, and professionalism. The street seemed to hold its breath as the encounter balanced on the edge of potential escalation or resolution. The senior officer's calm presence was not passive. It was active, commanding, and steady. It conveyed confidence without arrogance, authority without aggression. He was showing silently but clearly that real strength did not come from fear or assumptions, but from discipline, respect, and control. And in that moment, the first stage of the encounter reached its peak. The officer's assumptions had been challenged. The tension was palpable, and the senior officer remained calm, poised, and unshaken. The story of this traffic stop, which could have ended in fear or conflict, was now entering a moment that would define how both men perceived authority, respect, and human dignity. The tension between the two men continued to build, though outwardly, nothing seemed to have changed. The senior officer stood by his car, hands visible, posture straight, eyes calm but alert. He had been trained for situations like this, but even he could feel the growing unease in the air. There was something about the way the young police officer's gaze lingered on him that made it clear this was no ordinary traffic stop. The officer began pacing slightly, circling the front of the car as if trying to find a justification for his suspicion. His hand hovered near his holster, an unspoken warning that the situation could turn dangerous at any moment. Every movement he made seemed heavy with impatience and an underlying tension. He spoke, his voice low but sharp. "Step away from the vehicle," he commanded. There was an edge to his words, a subtle threat that told the senior officer he was being tested, not just questioned. The senior officer complied, stepping slowly and deliberately away from the car. He kept his hands clearly visible and his body language remained non-threatening. Yet his mind was alert. He analyzed every movement, every expression, every subtle shift in the officer's stance. Years of military service had trained him to read people quickly, to understand intentions before actions were taken. He could sense the officer's anger, but also the fear behind it. Fear of losing control, fear of being challenged by someone who would not submit to intimidation. "Do you know who I am?" the police officer demanded suddenly, his voice rising slightly. It was a question meant to unsettle, to provoke a reaction. The senior officer looked at him calmly, meeting his gaze evenly. "I do," he said softly, "and I am here to cooperate fully. Let us resolve this without conflict." The officer's hand twitched, brushing against his holster. The subtle motion sent a clear message. He was ready to escalate if he felt threatened. The senior officer noticed this immediately. He did not flinch, did not raise his voice, but he internally prepared for what could come next. He knew that in moments like this, fear or sudden movements could escalate the situation quickly. Staying calm was the only way to prevent disaster. Around them, life continued. Cars passed by, some slowing slightly as drivers noticed the tension on the roadside. A few pedestrians stopped, curious but cautious, sensing that something serious was unfolding. The senior officer was aware of their presence but ignored it. His focus remained entirely on the officer in front of him. He had no intention of letting outside distractions affect his actions. The officer finally spoke again, his voice tense. "Why are you so calm? Most people would be nervous, scared even. You're cooperating, but it's different with you." His eyes darted to the uniform, then back to the officer's face. There was a hint of suspicion, a hint of disbelief. It was clear he was trying to reconcile the calm demeanor with the authority the uniform represented. The senior officer replied evenly, choosing his words with care. "Calmness comes from experience. I have faced danger and responsibility before, far greater than what is happening here. There is no need for fear on either side." His tone was soft but firm, and it carried a subtle authority that the officer could not ignore. For a moment, the young officer hesitated. His fingers had been tightening slightly around the holster. Now he paused, uncertainty flickering across his face. He had approached this stop assuming control, assuming authority, assuming that the man in front of him would be intimidated. But here was someone who was calm, who refused to be provoked, who did not submit to assumptions. The officer's frustration began to show. He stepped closer, his face tight with tension. "Step back," he barked, almost reflexively, as if needing to assert dominance. The senior officer did not move backward. Instead, he held his ground, hands raised slightly to show he was not a threat. His expression remained steady, reassuring even, as if silently saying, "There is no need for hostility." A few people on the sidewalk whispered among themselves. "Why is he not scared?" one asked. "That officer looks like he's about to do something." Another shook their head. "I don't know. That man is calm, too calm. It's strange." The senior officer remained aware of the whispers but ignored them. He knew that the way he carried himself could influence the outcome. Panic, fear, or anger could make this worse. Calmness could prevent it. The officer's hand moved again, brushing the holster more deliberately this time. The senior officer noticed, assessing the situation. He realized that the officer might escalate further if nothing changed. This was no longer just about traffic. This was about control, assumptions, and the dangerous mix of authority and bias. He decided to speak using words to create a pause. "Officer," he said calmly, his voice carrying over the distant hum of traffic. "I am here to cooperate. I'm not a threat. Let us handle this professionally." "There is no reason for escalation." The officer stopped moving for a brief second. The words seemed to confuse him. He was used to people being nervous, defensive, or argumentative. This man was none of those things. His calmness was disarming, unsettling, and it created a crack in the officer's confidence. Still, the officer's fingers lingered near the holster. He was trained to assert authority, to react quickly, to control situations. But he was not trained for this, the quiet, steady presence of someone who refused to submit to fear. He glanced at the uniform again, the insignia glinting faintly in the sunlight, and something shifted in his mind. Perhaps it was respect, perhaps uncertainty, but the officer froze for a fraction of a second, and in that instant, the balance of power subtly changed. The senior officer took advantage of the pause, speaking again. "We can solve this without any problem. I understand your duty, your responsibility. I respect that. I ask only that you respect mine as well." His tone was firm, measured, and unshakable. The officer's breathing grew slightly heavier. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down, the tension rising. He was caught between his authority, his assumptions, and the reality in front of him. Here was a man who had authority of his own, authority that did not come from fear or aggression but from experience, discipline, and calmness. A sudden breeze moved through the street, rustling leaves and carrying faint sounds of distant traffic. The pedestrians shifted slightly, some taking small steps back. The senior officer noticed, understanding that people were watching, but he ignored it. He focused entirely on the officer, keeping his voice steady. "Officer, I have faced real danger," he said quietly but clearly. "I have been responsible for lives, for operations, for people who depended on me. I am not here to challenge you. I am here to cooperate. Let us resolve this safely." The officer hesitated again. His eyes flicked away briefly, then returned. There was a flicker of uncertainty, a realization that perhaps he had misjudged the situation. The senior officer remained calm, unwavering, showing no fear, no hostility, only quiet authority. Finally, the officer's hand began to move away from the holster slightly, though it did not fully relax. He was unsure, hesitant, caught between training and instinct, between assumptions and reality. The senior officer noticed this subtle shift, the slight easing of tension, and continued speaking in a calm, steady voice. "Cooperation and respect make situations like this easier for both of us," he said. "I am here to do exactly that. There is no reason for this to escalate." The officer's jaw tightened, his eyes still wary, but the tension in his body began to lessen ever so slightly. The calmness, the patience, and the steady authority of the senior officer had begun to work. The power dynamic was shifting, not through fear or aggression, but through dignity, discipline, and composure. The pedestrians on the sidewalk began to relax slightly, sensing that the immediate danger had lessened. Some whispered quietly, remarking on the unusual calm of the man in uniform. "He's not afraid at all," one said. "Even that officer seems nervous now." The senior officer ignored the comments, his focus remaining entirely on resolving the situation peacefully. Time seemed to stretch. Each second felt heavy with the possibility of escalation, yet the senior officer remained a pillar of calm. He understood the dangerous mix of authority, assumptions, and human emotion that could easily spiral out of control. His goal was simple: maintain composure, prevent escalation, and ensure safety for everyone. The officer finally took a small step back, lowering his hand slightly. The holster was still there, still a symbol of potential danger, but the immediate threat had lessened. The senior officer's calm authority had begun to influence the situation. Words, demeanor, and presence had done more to de-escalate than any command or threat could have. The breeze moved again, carrying the distant hum of traffic and faint murmurs from pedestrians. The senior officer stood tall, calm, and steady. The officer in front of him hesitated, unsure of the next move, caught between the authority of his badge and the reality of the man in uniform. In that moment, the story reached a critical point. The tension was still high, the danger real, but the senior officer's calm, human presence was slowly shifting the balance. The first stage of escalation had passed, and the next moment would determine whether the situation resolved peacefully or escalated further. The tension on the roadside was thick enough to feel, as if the air itself had become heavy. The senior officer remained calm, standing beside his car with his hands clearly visible, his uniform perfectly neat despite the growing unease. Every muscle in his body was relaxed but ready. He knew that at any moment, the young police officer could make a move that might escalate the situation dangerously. Yet he did not panic. He had faced far greater dangers in his life, and he knew that remaining composed was the key to controlling this encounter. The young officer, however, was still uncertain. His hands lingered near the holster, his eyes darting to the uniform then back to the man's face. The confidence that had carried him through countless routine stops seemed to falter here. He had expected nervousness, maybe hesitation, possibly even fear, but he had not expected this quiet, steady authority. The calmness of the man before him was not submissive. It was controlled, measured, and quietly commanding. Finally, the officer spoke again, his voice carrying both suspicion and challenge. "You seem awfully calm for someone I just pulled over. Do you know how this looks? Do you know what could happen if I decide you're a threat?" His tone was sharp, almost defensive. He was trying to regain control, to assert dominance, to put the other man in a position of fear. The senior officer responded evenly, his voice steady and unwavering. "I understand, officer. I also understand your responsibility to ensure public safety. I have no intention of causing trouble. I am here to cooperate fully. There is no reason for either of us to escalate this." His words were calm but carried a subtle authority. He was not just speaking to pacify, he was speaking to reason, to appeal to the officer's better judgment. For a moment, the officer froze. There was a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He had assumed that this would be a routine stop, an easy demonstration of control. He had assumed that fear or anger would dominate the person he was questioning. But here was someone entirely different, someone who did not react as expected, someone whose composure was unshakable. The senior officer continued, noticing the slight hesitation. "Officer, I am not here to challenge you. I respect your position. I respect the authority you hold. But I also ask that you respect mine." His tone was firm, deliberate, and calm. Every word was measured, designed to communicate both cooperation and authority. The officer's hand twitched again near the holster. He was caught in a strange conflict. Part of him wanted to assert control, to act on the assumptions he had made. Another part of him recognized the unusual situation, the calmness, the dignity, and the authority of the man standing in front of him. He had been trained for obedience and for authority, but nothing in his training had prepared him for this kind of encounter. The senior officer sensed the change. He could see the uncertainty flickering across the young officer's face. It was subtle, but it was there. This was the moment to maintain calmness, to show authority without aggression, to prevent the situation from spiraling out of control. He spoke again, his voice low and steady. "We can handle this peacefully, officer. There is no need for fear, no need for aggression. Let us resolve this situation together." The officer paused, processing the words. He looked at the uniform again, the badges and insignia glinting in the sunlight, and something seemed to strike him. He had seen many uniforms, many signs of authority, but there was a difference here, a presence, a calm command that went beyond the surface. For a brief moment, the officer's confidence wavered. He had expected a different reaction, and now he was faced with the unexpected. Respect and authority matched with calm composure. The senior officer noticed the pause and decided to give a little more clarity. "Officer," he said quietly, "I have served for many years. I have been responsible for people's lives, for operations, for situations far more dangerous than this. I am not here to challenge you, but I am here to cooperate and ensure this is handled safely." His words were simple, but they carried the weight of experience. He did not need to shout or threaten. His presence alone conveyed the authority of someone who had been trained to lead, to make decisions under pressure, and to remain calm in the face of danger. The officer's eyes flicked downward for a moment, then back up. He shifted slightly, as if reconsidering his next move. The hand near the holster relaxed ever so slightly, though not completely. The balance of power was beginning to change, not through force but through the quiet, steady presence of someone who refused to be intimidated. Around them, people on the street were still watching. A few had taken out their phones, unsure whether to intervene or simply observe. Whispers floated through the air. "That man is not afraid at all," one said. "Even the officer looks nervous now." The senior officer was aware of the attention but ignored it. His focus was entirely on the young officer, on ensuring that nothing escalated unnecessarily. The officer finally spoke again, his tone softer, less certain. "Why are you so confident?" Most people would be scared in this situation. There was an undercurrent of suspicion but also curiosity. He was trying to understand why the man before him reacted so differently. The senior officer responded evenly, his voice calm but firm. "Confidence comes from experience and understanding. I have faced danger and responsibility far beyond this moment. There is no reason to be afraid here. I am cooperating fully, and I hope we can resolve this safely." His gaze remained steady, meeting the officer's eyes without challenge, without aggression, but with quiet authority. The officer blinked, then looked away briefly, unsure of what to say. The senior officer could sense the internal struggle, the officer's assumptions, his need to assert control, his realization that he was facing someone who could not be intimidated. It was a delicate moment, one that could go in many directions depending on the next actions. The senior officer decided to offer a gentle but firm reminder of professionalism. "We both have responsibilities," he said quietly. "You are trained to protect the public. I am trained to protect people and operations. There is no conflict here except for assumptions. Let us not let assumptions drive our actions. Let us act professionally." The officer's breathing slowed slightly. His hand had moved a little further from the holster. The tension in his body was easing, though not completely. The senior officer's calm, measured approach was beginning to influence the young officer's perception. He was realizing slowly that his assumptions had been flawed. A faint breeze moved down the street, rustling leaves and carrying the distant sounds of traffic. The pedestrians had shifted slightly, sensing a change in the tension. The senior officer noticed the subtle shift and continued to maintain his presence, steady and calm. His voice remained quiet but authoritative. "Officer, we can resolve this safely," he said. "I am here to cooperate fully. I have nothing to hide, and I do not wish to escalate the situation. I ask only for professionalism and respect." The officer hesitated, looking at the uniform again. There was something in the way the man stood, in the clarity of his eyes and the steadiness of his posture, that made the officer pause. He had expected fear, submission, maybe even hostility. Instead, he found none of those things. What he found was calm, quiet authority and dignity that could not be ignored. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sounds were the distant traffic, the rustle of leaves, and the faint murmur of pedestrians. The officer's hand moved slightly, adjusting near the holster, but the aggressive edge in his stance was fading. The senior officer remained still, his calm presence a silent assertion that he would not be intimidated, but also that he would not provoke. Then, the senior officer made a subtle move. He reached into a pocket of his uniform and retrieved a small badge and credentials. He held them up slowly, clearly visible. "Officer, I hope this clarifies any concerns," he said calmly. "I am a senior military officer. I have served for many years, and I am here to cooperate. I ask that we resolve this safely and professionally." The effect was immediate. The young officer froze, his eyes widening slightly as he processed the information. His hand lingered near the holster, then slowly began to retreat. He had assumed that he held authority over the situation, but the revelation changed everything. The uniform, the experience, the calmness, it all combined to create a presence that demanded respect. The pedestrians nearby sensed the shift instantly. Some whispered in disbelief, others simply watched, unable to comprehend the sudden change. The young officer was caught between his training, his assumptions, and the reality standing before him. For the first time, he was unsure of how to act, unsure of what authority truly meant in this moment. The senior officer remained calm, observing the reaction without a hint of satisfaction or arrogance. He had achieved what he needed. The immediate threat had been diffused, the assumptions challenged, and the situation remained under control. His presence, his words, and his demeanor had created space for reason to replace prejudice. The officer took a small step back, visibly shaken, but no longer aggressive. He muttered something under his breath, unclear and awkward, as if searching for the right words. The senior officer maintained eye contact, quietly signaling that the situation was now safe, that further aggression was unnecessary, and that mutual respect could guide the next moments. Time seemed to stretch again. The breeze carried a faint coolness. The sounds of the city continued, and the tension slowly lifted. The pedestrians began to relax slightly, some nodding to themselves at the sight of calm authority prevailing over aggression and prejudice. In that moment, it became clear that the encounter had entered a new phase. The assumptions, the bias, and the potential for conflict had been confronted and disrupted. The revelation of the senior officer's rank, experience, and calm authority had created a pause, a moment of reflection, and an opportunity for the young officer to reconsider his action. The revelation had changed everything. The young officer froze in place, his hand lingering near the holster for a moment longer, then slowly withdrawing. His eyes were wide, a mix of shock, confusion, and a dawning realization. The man standing in front of him was no ordinary civilian. This was a senior military officer, someone whose authority came not from intimidation or fear but from years of experience, discipline, and leadership. The young officer's aggressive stance began to waver, replaced by uncertainty. For the senior officer, the goal had always been clear: de-escalation, patience, and calm authority. He had not wanted to provoke, not wanted to assert dominance aggressively. He simply remained composed, speaking clearly and respectfully, ensuring that every movement he made was non-threatening but firm. His uniform carried the weight of service, but it was his demeanor that truly conveyed authority. The young officer shifted his weight uneasily. He had approached this stop with assumptions, thinking he could intimidate the man into submission. That assumption had been shattered. He glanced at the uniform again, then at the credentials displayed, and the full reality began to sink in. The officer's mind raced, caught between his training, his ingrained bias, and the unexpected calm of the man before him. He was unsure of how to proceed, unsure if he had just made a grave mistake. The senior officer noticed the subtle change in posture, the hesitation in the young man's eyes. He did not exploit it aggressively, nor did he gloat. Instead, he spoke with quiet authority, his tone steady and calm. "Officer, I understand your duty. I respect your responsibility to protect the public. I am here to cooperate fully. There is no reason for conflict between us." His voice carried a weight that went beyond words. It conveyed experience, dignity, and a commitment to professionalism. The officer took a slow, uneven breath. The adrenaline in his body began to fade slightly, replaced by an awareness of the situation's gravity. He had almost let assumptions and prejudice dictate his actions. Now, confronted with the truth, he realized how close he had come to creating a situation that could have ended in tragedy. His hand moved fully away from the holster, but his gaze still held uncertainty. The senior officer did not rush the moment. He understood the power of patience, the importance of giving the other person time to process. He allowed the silence to linger, letting the young officer absorb the reality without adding pressure or commentary. In that silence, the presence of calm authority became even more pronounced. Around them, the city moved on. Yet the scene remained unusual. Pedestrians who had paused to watch the encounter now whispered to one another, sensing the change in the dynamic. "Did you see that?" "The officer looks completely unsure now," one remarked quietly. Another nodded. "That man didn't flinch once." "Not once." The senior officer was aware of the observation, but he ignored it. His focus was entirely on ensuring the situation remained safe and controlled. The officer's voice finally broke the silence, low and hesitant. I didn't realize." His words trailed off. He seemed to be struggling to find the right way to respond. The senior officer maintained his calm demeanor, giving him space without judgment. There was no rush, no condescension, just steady professional presence. The young officer took a small step back, lowering his head slightly. The uniform, the experience, the calm words, all had forced him into a moment of reflection. He realized he had been acting on bias, on assumptions rather than facts. The senior officer's authority had not come from aggression or threat, but from presence, patience, and integrity. It was a lesson in professionalism and dignity that the officer could not ignore. "Officer," the senior officer said softly, "I know this may be surprising, but we can still handle this properly. There is no reason for escalation. I am here to cooperate fully." His voice was calm, yet it carried an unspoken weight, the kind that comes from years of leadership and experience. The young officer hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, I see that now," he said quietly, almost to himself. His body language shifted further, his shoulders relaxing slightly, the tension in his face softening. The realization of the situation's seriousness began to sink in. He had approached this stop ready to assert dominance, ready to react with force if needed. Now, confronted with truth and dignity, he felt a mixture of guilt and relief. The senior officer noticed the change but did not speak immediately. He allowed the officer to gather his thoughts, to regain composure, to acknowledge silently that the assumptions guiding his actions had been mistaken. It was a subtle human moment, a pause where both men understood the weight of authority, professionalism, and responsibility. The officer's gaze finally met the senior officer's again. There was a flicker of apology in his eyes, though he did not speak the words aloud. The presence of the senior officer had compelled him to reflect, to reconsider, and to recognize the human dignity that had been challenged but never broken. The senior officer decided to offer a clear path forward. "Officer, we can end this calmly. I will answer any questions you have, provide any clarification you need, and we can both continue with our duties without conflict." His voice was firm but gentle, reinforcing the choice of professionalism over confrontation. The officer swallowed hard, then nodded again. Yes, sir. I understand now. I acted prematurely," he admitted, his voice unsteady but sincere. There was no arrogance, no excuse, just recognition of his error. The senior officer nodded slightly, acknowledging the admission. Around them, pedestrians began to relax, sensing that the tension had finally diminished. Cars passed by, returning to their normal pace. The street noises returned to their usual background hum, but the impact of the encounter lingered in the air. The lesson was subtle but profound. Assumptions could be dangerous, and patience, calmness, and dignity were far more powerful than aggression or fear. The officer took another small step back, fully lowering his hand from the holster. He was still wary, still processing, but the immediate threat was gone. The senior officer maintained his calm, steady presence, reinforcing the sense of safety and control. The dynamic had shifted completely. What had begun as a tense and potentially dangerous encounter had been transformed by authority grounded in experience, not threat. The senior officer spoke again, quietly and firmly. "We can move on from here professionally. There is no reason to let this define our interaction. Let us handle this with respect and clarity." His words were simple but carried a deep weight. They reminded the officer that true authority was not demonstrated through intimidation, but through integrity and restraint. The young officer nodded slowly, his voice quieter but steadier. "Yes, I see that now. Thank you for your patience, sir." It was a human moment, a recognition that both men had roles, responsibilities, and expectations, but that respect and professionalism could guide their interaction even in tense circumstances. The senior officer allowed a small, understanding nod. "It is important that we both remember this moment," he said. "It is a reminder that assumptions can lead to dangerous situations, but patience and professionalism can prevent harm." His tone was reflective, calm, and steady. The officer's body language softened further. He straightened slightly, his posture less defensive, his expression more thoughtful. The realization had fully set in. His assumptions had been flawed, his actions had been guided by bias, and he had been confronted with the power of calm authority and experience. For the senior officer, the encounter had been a test of patience and professionalism. He had maintained composure, ensured safety, and demonstrated that authority came from experience and discipline rather than aggression. For the young officer, it had been a lesson in humility, awareness, and the human impact of assumptions. The pedestrians slowly resumed their paths, some whispering quietly about what they had witnessed. The young officer remained for a moment longer, collecting his thoughts before finally stepping back toward his car. He did not speak further, but his expression had changed. There was a mix of reflection, understanding, and the subtle awareness that he had almost let bias dictate his actions. The senior officer returned to his car, maintaining a composed demeanor. He understood the significance of the encounter, not just for himself but for everyone who had witnessed it. It was a reminder that calm authority, dignity, and patience could transform even the tensest situations into lessons of respect and professionalism. The young officer lingered for a final moment, then nodded quietly and returned to his vehicle. There was no hostility, no confrontation, only reflection. The senior officer watched as the police car drove away. The tension, snap judgments were common, and they could lead to unnecessary tension and conflict. Yet the choice to respond with patience, calmness, and dignity could transform even the most volatile situations. Authority exercised with integrity was far more powerful than authority exercised through fear or aggression. He considered how this encounter might influence his own behavior as well. Reflection was an essential part of service, and every interaction was an opportunity to learn, to refine judgment, and to reinforce the values that guided him. Patience, respect, and professionalism were not abstract ideals. They were practical tools that could save lives, prevent escalation, and demonstrate the power of human dignity. The senior officer arrived at his home, the familiar streets and quiet neighborhood providing a sense of calm after the tension-filled afternoon. Yet the encounter remained vivid in his mind. He knew that the lessons were not only for the young officer or the pedestrians, but also for himself. Every interaction, every choice, and every moment of calm authority reinforced the principles he had spent a lifetime upholding. He parked his car and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the evening air. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the streets. The city had returned to its usual rhythm, but the memory of the encounter lingered, a quiet reminder of human behavior, dignity, and the power of composed authority. The senior officer entered his home feeling a sense of quiet reflection. He knew that moments like these were rare but significant. They tested patience, judgment, and integrity, and they left lasting impressions on everyone involved. He understood that his calmness, composure, and professionalism had made a difference, not through force or intimidation, but through presence, authority, and respect. He sat quietly, allowing the events of the day to settle in his mind. The encounter had been more than a simple traffic stop. It had been a lesson in humanity, a demonstration of the consequences of assumptions, and a reminder that dignity, patience, and respect could prevail even in tense situations. The senior officer reflected on the importance of sharing such lessons, not through preaching but through example. Every interaction was an opportunity to teach, to guide, and to influence human behavior positively. The quiet power of calm authority, the subtle impact of patience, and the human ability to respond with dignity were lessons that extended far beyond the immediate encounter. He finally allowed himself a moment of peace. The tension of the afternoon had passed, replaced by reflection, understanding, and a quiet appreciation for the human capacity to influence, guide, and transform. He knew that the encounter would remain with him, a vivid reminder of the power of patience, composure, and dignity in the face of bias and assumption.